Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's event on redefining transatlantic economic security. Uh, there's a lot to talk about these days, and I'm really excited for today's conversation. Let me start by introducing our panelists today, and then we'll jump right into the conversation. We've got 45 minutes together today. If you have questions, I would encourage you to put those in the chat or the Q&A function, and we'll try to weave them in throughout the course of the event. First off, we have Peter Rashish, my co-host and VP and Director of Geopolitics for the American German Institute. We also have Jeannette Chu, Vice President for National Security Policy at the National Foreign Trade Council and a non-resident senior associate at CSIS in Washington, D.C. Next, we have Pawel Swieboda. He's the Senior Visiting Fellow and Co-Director of the Brussels Economic Security Forum, the European Policy Center's flagship project on economic security based in Brussels. And last, we have Jean Froehly, the Minister for Economic and Financial Affairs in the Embassy of Germany in Washington, D.C. So just a few things to talk about after yesterday's kind of landmark announcements around tariffs. So I'm going to start with you, Peter. As we think about some of what has happened yesterday and some of the announcements and the use of the International Economic Powers Act, Emergency Economics Power Act, as a justification for the tariffs. Economic security was referenced many times. I wonder if you could kind of kick things off today and talk about what is economic security, maybe how the tariffs fit into what some of us have thought of as economic security, and what do you think the goals of economic security are, and what policies besides tariffs does it include?
Sure, thanks, Penny. With regard to yesterday's announcements, I would say that there's a range of tools that can be used to advance a country's economic security. And one key question is, when are tariffs the appropriate tool, or when would some other tools be better? Would other tools be more appropriate? And I also think there's a question of which countries should be the focus of economic security actions and the different kinds of tools available. So that would be my reaction to yesterday. More broadly, or stepping back a bit, I do think that to understand what economic security means, we need to sort of put it in the context of what's been happening with the global economic order, as well as some broader geopolitical trends. Because I would say that until about 10 years ago, the US and its partners were essentially focus on deepening the rules-based trading system mainly through free trade agreements. Two well-known examples were the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, neither of which, of course, made it over the finish line. But now I think on both sides of the Atlantic, we see more emphasis on dealing with an unruly global economy rather than creating new rules for it. And I think we can see a lot of reasons for this increased economic disorder. I mean, the main one I do think is China's economic practices. These include its manufacturing overcapacity and the impacts that has on jobs, on production, on economic well-being, whether it's in the US or I would say increasingly in Europe, but also even more aggressive economic policies, more coercive ones to advance its strategic interests. But I think there are other reasons. I don't think it's only China. There's also, I think, certain issues which have been challenging for the trading system, like creating a governance regime for artificial intelligence or for climate policies. And then you have really kind of hardcore geopolitical challenges like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is also putting a stress on the system. So given all this, if I had to try to define economic security, my own view would be that it's a foreign economic policy that places a premium on the use of anti-coercion and, if necessary, coercion to promote a country's interests, under conditions of global economic disorder. And then in terms of the policies that can be used, I mean, would include classic trade measures like tariffs or countervailing duties, but also trying to increase the resilience of supply chains, inbound and outbound investment screening, export controls and sanctions, but also more novel ideas that are being discussed, like restrictions on participation in government procurement contracts, or even limiting the protection of intellectual property rights.
Great, thank you, Peter. Thanks for that. Kicking us off with, so we have a kind of common understanding, I think, to begin with, of what we're talking about today. So Jeannette, let's dig into kind of the U.S. aspects of this. So President Trump released an executive order called the American First Trade Policy, which aimed to balance national security with economic interest. Particularly, he had quite a few requests in there for reports on things like where we should be going with export controls, where we should be going with sanctions, and what we should be doing with investment screening. And so I would love to hear from you, what's the same? Where are we going to keep continue with the policies that have been in place for a while? And maybe you could talk a little bit about what those are. And where do we think we're going to see a shift under the Trump administration with regards to economic security tools?
Thanks so much, Penny. Thank you for letting me join this terrific discussion. My thanks as well to our sponsors, of course, the German Marshall Fund and the American German Institute, for making today's webinar possible. We hear a lot about balancing, quote unquote, national security and economic security, or economic interests. I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding, if you will. The very first line of the America First Trade Policy looks back on the first Trump administration, and at that time stated that the American economy, American workers, and national security all come first. It's first among equals. During the first administration, they used economic and trade levers to pursue national security, right? Now, the current administration is relying on this America First trade policy to, and I'm quoting, above all, benefit American workers, manufacturers, farmers, ranchers, entrepreneurs, and businesses. So yes, defend economic and national security, but above all, benefit the parties named. So when we press a bit, and I'm so grateful, Peter, that you started us off with a very clear yet nuanced definition of economic security, because I think this gets muddled all the time, right? We hear a lot about economic and national security kind of being converged, if you will. In fact, take a look at the America First investment policy released just 1 month after the trade policy. And that specifically states economic security is national security. So again, less of a balance, more of a statement of equivalency. One is not subordinate or in service to the other. Penny, you mentioned that the America First trade policy seeks a number of reports. You ask about how this might play out. I note that in a recent public forum, Commerce's Undersecretary for Industry and Security, Jeffrey Kessler, said that trade agreements should include export controls as a component of these trade agreements in the future, and that investment security, which is far more than, for example, just screening, is in furtherance of both national security and economic security priorities. So before we leave this, I want to just insert a cautionary note, much like Peter mentioned, that national security is more than just export controls. In fact, here at the National Foreign Trade Council, I've defined our national security work stream along 6 core issue areas: export controls, sanctions, foreign investment security, inbound and outbound, what I call forward technologies, which are foundational, critical frontier technologies as they affect warfighters, China, and a catch-all for example, ICTS, which is one of the reports, Penny, that you mentioned on connected vehicles. And ICTS, of course, was created during the first Trump administration. And the use of IEPA, which, of course, we saw just yesterday with respect to the tariffs that were announced. And again, an interesting national security and economic security tool.
Great, thank you. Can I just clarify something real quick, Jeanette? So was it the Undersecretary of Bureau of Industry and Security said that investment screening should also be a part of trade agreements moving forward?
No, that
Separate, okay.
export controls.
Only export controls, got it.
Right,
Okay.
right. But certainly, for investment screening is another area for which the America First trade policy talks about requiring a report.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Thank you so much. So Jean, in Europe, would love to get the German perspective here. So in Europe, economic security, as we've talked about, is both a security issue, which is a national competency, as well as a trade issue or economic issue, which is more of a European level competency. And at the same time, I think you have German policy shifting a bit on security and particularly defense, both with some really groundbreaking changes on the financial levels that will be dedicated to security by Germany in the coming years. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how is Germany's approach changing, and how are you thinking about moving forward on this and the cooperation at both the European level and maybe at the US level?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to contribute to this discussion. Let me say, first of all, that it is from a more theoretical basis. I mean, securitization of economy and trade is not new. This is something also already mentioned by the previous speakers. It is something which has always been part of our discussions, either on a more sectorial side with export controls, with the understanding that some goods are too sensitive to end up in the wrong hands, or on the other hand, restricting trade with some countries. I mean, this is the whole sanctions, part. Especially in Germany, there was for a long time the impression that trade is something which is particularly positive per se. And it is, in my opinion, with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that some things changed at the first place. I think also our experience with China contributed equally to that change, and this led to an increased, perception that economic security is something we have to integrate more in our in the way we shape economic policy. So what we can see from this point, that in Germany we have an increased securitization of investment, of trade, of energy, first of all. So I mean, if we look back 10 years ago, energy and energy supply was seen as something purely economic, where companies should be involved, and now energy security, after the experience, is something we have we discuss today. And of course, this is in itself, or what we can call the Zeitenwende, the turning point, where we see now a sort of Zeitenwende 2.0 at the moment, with money mobilized for defense at a huge scale, which money mobilized for infrastructure at a huge scale. So obviously this is a kind of a realignment per se between concepts of economic security. So let me, however, give one word on yesterday's announcements. So I think we agree now on certain aspects, that, I mean, the initial understanding or deal of the global trade order, that a free trade is a good thing for us all per se. I mean, there is the understanding that we have to put this into question, so that indeed we have to talk about trade barriers. And of course, we took very much note of the report of USTR on Tuesday. So it is a very interesting document because it provides in detail a very good explanation of how trade barriers in the European Union are perceived here. I think it's a very interesting document, and it's a very good base for discussion. So if we even share some underlying questions also on how we shape manufacturing in our countries and how we can support workforce and skills. We, however, reject the tools and the answers because we deeply believe that that the underlying fundamentals of the trade between the US and Europe and the trade between the US and Germany are positive. So it is basically investment follows trade. Investment is not following tariffs. Investment follows trade, and trade follows investment. And we can see that in a very good report by the Chamber of Commerce on the insides of the transatlantic economy. And here we clearly see how the economies between Europe and the US are interlinked. So that what was announced yesterday will only do harm to both sides of the Atlantics. Yeah. And that's why we are we have to talk, and we have to find a common understanding and on what security means. But we have also to find a common understanding that our mutual trade and investment relations are positive for everybody.
Thank you for that. And I 100% agree. In fact, I think the deep US-EU investment relationship, which is 25 times what the US-China investment relationship is, makes that relationship much more sticky, and decoupling in these times is just not an option. And I also take your point, Jean, of the with regards to the fact that there's a common understanding, and it seems to me identification of some of the problems. It's just we've got to find a way to come up with mutually acceptable solutions to address some of these issues moving forward. With that, Pawel, I'm going to turn to you to kind of give us another perspective. So one of the things that's going on in Europe is also this desire to improve innovation and to improve the innovative climate in Europe to help it with its growth. And I'm just curious, you've got a background as an entrepreneur and working with a lot of innovative industries. And as we think about the Draghi report and we think about spurring innovation in Europe, what's the role of economic security with regards to innovation moving forward?
Yeah, thank you very much, Penny, for your questions and for having me as well. Let me just start with where Jean left it before me, and I will immediately move to your question, because it is a very somber mood today in Europe. European Commission President has said we have been let down by our oldest ally. And I think that expresses well the type of sentiment that we deal with, and it's I would say particularly underlined by two aspects. One is the fact that, as you also said, the transatlantic economic relationship is a pillar of the global economy. It has served both sides of the Atlantic well over the years. And what is more, it is a balanced relationship when you look across the goods and services, right? It's something that unfortunately is too easily forgotten. That yes, the European Union has a surplus in the trade in goods, but the United States has a surplus in services, and as a whole, it is a balanced relationship, and it needs to be looked at as such. The Europeans send 300 billion of euro of their savings annually to the United States. And that needs to be also taken into consideration. The second issue is the fact that President Trump evoked the Emergency Economic Powers Act, originating back to 1977, and meant to serve the US in times of national emergency originating from the outside. Well, it's difficult, to be honest, to see a prosperous and decades-long economic relationship between the US and Europe as a source of a national emergency with every imagination one can deploy to this question. So indeed, as Jean underlined, let's hope that negotiations can be taken up as soon as possible. And I stress as soon as possible because damage can easily be done, but not all of the damage is easily undone. And therefore, we have to be very careful about the next few weeks, and we have to approach this with the best of will on both sides. By going straight to your question, I think what is important about the European approach to economic security is that we believe in open economic security, so meaning economic security that is based on engagement with partners internationally. And that also serves the goal of innovation, because a lot of innovation is, in fact, innovation that is developed across the different regions of the globe. So Europe is the number one trading partner of about 80 countries in the world. Altogether, this is close to 40% of global trade. So we will remain faithful to this concept of open economic security. That is economic security that can serve everybody. It's not an isolationist policy. It's a policy that promotes collaboration. And indeed, I think this moment, disruptive as it is, can help Europe to leapfrog in innovation, because it is a concern of ours that we tend to specialize in what can be called mid-tech or mid-technology. So traditionally, this has been cars, machinery, while higher value added is clearly today coming from high technology. So for Europe, what is heart of the agenda is to climb that ladder from mid-tech to high-tech specialization, and I believe that that the current period will help us to achieve that objective. And economic security, together with closing the innovation gap, are indeed at the heart of the economic agenda for the coming 5 years. And in this period, we will also need to focus on what is the unique selling point of the European approach, right? And as opposed to what is best being done in the United States, what is best being done in China. So I think the overall approach is that we will do our best to use this opportunity to move ahead in innovation. Also, moving towards deeper capital markets, which are essential for the purpose. And I think what is currently going on internationally will in fact strengthen the international role of the euro and will allow the European Union to also deepen its capital markets. That is an essential component of moving ahead with innovation.
Great, thank you so much. Jean, I know you have to leave us shortly to go to another event. Thank you for spending time on this very busy morning with us. Can I just ask you before you leave? So I think a lot of times we frame economic security in the context of China. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on as we look at this moment in history, is China an area of cooperation as we think about economic security tools, as we think about protecting our industries, our innovation from potentially other actors that are state-directed, state-run? I'm just curious if we could get your quick thoughts on, is China a path, joint work with regards to China and other similar state actors, a path forward?
Thank you. Before coming to China, I wanted to quickly say something about Russia, because this makes to better understand my point. When Russia fully invaded Ukraine in February 22, the Europeans did an excellent job in readjusting their energy and economic policy. It was very, very painful, and that's why also we had to do it step by step. And we had to do it in a sense not to harm our societies more than to harm Russia. So this experience is also applicable when we talk about de-risking from China and adjusting our supply chains and to shape a new world trade order. So there is a growing consciousness in Germany, within the government and also within the business community, that dependencies in a general sense, but also dependencies on China are doing harm and are to be adjusted and to be taken care of. And this is also something we had been always in dialogue also with our American friends. We have to do it in a way that that we're not doing us more harm than China. So we have to do it taking into account the relationships of the companies, the value chains and the supply chains, and also in a timeline that is allowing us to do this in a transformative way, which is not doing excessive harm to investment decisions which had been taken in good faith some time ago.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I
Thank
think
you.
it's a really important point that, for one, tariffs are a tax on domestic consumers, domestic industries, and there's going to be quite an impact for anybody that has to put up money to bring goods into a country. And you want to make sure that as we think about moves forward, how do you phase that in a way that doesn't end up indirectly hurting yourself more than others? Thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
So thank you. Thanks, Jean, for joining us this morning. For those that are on, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and I'll be happy to pick them up. But let me go back to you, Peter. So let's continue on the China issue a bit. I thought that the injection of Russia is also an important one to put in. So, maybe to talk a little bit about what is the path forward on cooperation with these tools, and how do we think about economic security and economic coercion after yesterday's events in the United States? How do we start to reconcile this and then find paths to come back and work together on some of these issues?
Yeah, let me make one comment to reinforce what Jean just said. I do think that it's particularly with China, it's the experience of he mentioned Russia, but I think also in more kind of traditional trading areas, but also some areas of trade that are sensitive for security purposes. There's the experience in the US and Europe, both of these dependencies, particularly dependencies that are asymmetric, and the fear that China or any other rival in the global economy could leverage those asymmetric dependencies. So I think that is a key motivating factor in everything we're discussing today. But I would be a little cautious about saying it's only China. And the reason I say that is that, yes, China stands out because it's a very big economy. It's engaged in very heavy subsidization. It's engaged in export restrictions for critical minerals and other things, and it's also used coercive measures, as we saw, for example, in the case of Lithuania not too long ago. But I think there are other kind of underlying changes in the global economy that also account for why we're talking about economic security so much. And I think that one is that when you look at the global trading system, it is much more diverse than it was, 10 or 20 years ago in terms of which countries and which kinds of countries hold sway in it. And I think partly because of that, another reason that we have to look more broadly is that the WTO and other cooperative fora and agreements are not, which have traditionally been the guardian of the global trading system, are not doing as well at managing tension. So now I think countries are looking more at national, increasing their sovereignty, increasing their room for action to do things on their own. However, you asked about cooperation, and I think it's key to point out that, sure, sometimes it'll be more effective for countries or at large entities like the European Union to do things on their own, but there's no reason that cooperation with other like-minded countries, and what I mean by that is countries that share basically the same interests in the global economy, won't be more effective than acting on your own. So I think countries need to take it on a case-by-case basis in terms of which economy you're concerned about, and also take it on a case-by-case basis in terms of what kind of issue is at hand that you're concerned about. So I see nothing in an economic security framing for international economic policy or for how you analyze what's going on in the global economy that argues against cooperation.
Thank you very much for that, Peter. So, Jeannette, maybe to build on that, because I have seen also some remarks by the Undersecretary at Commerce that he didn't think that the Trade and Technology Council or other dialogues with allies was going to be a priority for the U.S. administration moving forward, and it was going to have a much stronger focus on U.S. enforcement against China. What are your thoughts on this? And what's driving this? And is that a good approach, or what are your thoughts on that?
Penny, thank you so much for the question. And Peter, thank you for raising something that has weighed heavily on my mind for several years now. I used to worry about hyper-rotation on China being something that could blind us to potential threats from other areas. And that worry has shifted over time a bit to more directionally some of the things that you and Pawel and Jean had also mentioned, right? That when you base your policy, regardless of whether that's national security or trade or economic security, on framing it around one adversary, you risk making mistakes that have been made in the past. For example, certain miscalculations about the former Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc that just did not bear out. And I'm starting to really worry significantly about that happening again, particularly with respect to China. I also want to preface my response, and I promise, Penny, I'm getting to that multilateralism is much more than just formal dialogues like the Trade and Technology Council or multilateral export control regimes or what have you. It's also these enduring ties, Pawel, I think you mentioned this as well, that we have had across the Atlantic now for almost a century, right? And there are also people-to-people and cultural and other business ties that, as you've all mentioned, are not easily severable. So within that context, and I certainly agree, Penny, in terms of some of the recent remarks made, I do want to note that I don't think we know enough quite yet, or have even seen enough to affirmatively say that this administration is deprioritizing dialogues. First of all, it's true that the administration is reviewing the costs and benefits and timeliness and effectiveness, again, of formal dialogues, be they multilateral, plurilateral, or even bilateral in some cases. But I would caution that we need to wait for the outcome of these analyses, including the reports that we've already discussed this morning that were called for in the America First trade policy. So that's kind of how I look at that dialogue issue. Now, certainly this really comes to the fore when we start to look at other mechanisms, when we look beyond tariffs, for example, and we try to look more comprehensively at enforcement mechanisms and trade remedies, very, very broad stroke. I think because I come from an export enforcement background, I tend to use that as a means to frame how I think about these macro issues. And with regard to that, I would say that I really hope that this administration will comprehensively contextualize the tools that they are looking for to anticipate and mitigate potential downside risk, whether they're economic or otherwise. I would also plead with our longtime allies and trading partners to please have patience as we get to that point. Certainly at the NFTC, we work really hard to identify potential inflection points where a proposed policy or legislation, regulation, what have you, starts to undercut or undermine an intended policy objective, particularly in the national security area. And to me, that is really a critically important unintended consequence that we need to talk about more. And we need to try to head off by offering constructive and prescriptive alternatives. So I would say, economic security tools need to be deployed with clarity, coherency, and wherever possible in a coordinated fashion, not only domestically here in the US through a well-established, very robust interagency consultative process, but also with allies and key trading partners, both diplomatically, state to state, as well as with industries.
Thank you for that.
Multilateralism is still relevant.
No, well, thank you for that. I think I like the 3 C's: clarity, consistency, and coordination. Pawel, I'm going to turn to you, but we also have 2 questions in the chat. So we've got about 5 minutes left. So one question is about for the tariff discussion and now the potential negotiations, what leverage does Europe bring to the table to help their side with regards to the negotiations? And second is, how does this spread to the financial markets? Given that investment in certain sectors in the West operates on market terms, but in other parts of the world operates on different terms, is there anything we can think about in terms of how capital is being deployed and what tools we can use there? 2 kind of different questions. But Pawel, I'm turning to you. If you want to answer either one or both of those in your answer, that'd be great. But just thinking about where is Europe going to go on some of these economic security efforts? Jeannette is saying we need to have a little patience in Europe with regards to while the US kind of sorts itself out. But it seems to me it's an area where Europe itself is still kind of at the nascent phases. And can you keep momentum to build a European effort on economic security while also giving the US some time to develop theirs?
Thank you, Penny. So first of all, Europe will definitely pursue an open dialogue with the US administration, hoping for a negotiated solution. I think that's in the nature of the European Union. And yes, there will be retaliation, and it will be a retaliation that unfortunately will be painful to a lot of American enterprises. That's the nature of the international economic order as we have it. Hopefully, this will be a de-escalatory logic in the next weeks. That's important to stress because a lot of damage can be done prematurely. Europe will also go to other regions of the world. The Commission President is already started her new term in office, 5-year term, with a trip to India. She's today in Central Asia, so she commented on the Trump tariffs from Central Asia. So this idea of promoting global partnerships will continue. Now, going to the question about services, well, given how much Europe buys of U.S. originated services, there is also a leverage, right? Europe can limit the access to its market, be it through procurement or licensing tools. So the instruments exist, but as I said at the beginning, I very much hope we will enter de-escalatory logic rather than a tit for tat. If it is a tit for tat, then the tariffs on goods will be reflected and reciprocated in the area of services, and that will move the entire conversation into a new territory altogether, because that's where the US clearly has a competitive advantage at the moment. Now, when it comes to the question about capital flows, there is that strand in the American debate, and you will know much better than I do, that tariffs on goods will be followed by tariffs on money. If that is the case, then we are facing a broader reconceptualization of the global economic relations. I think the way Europe will respond is to invest more in the role of the euro as a reserve currency and as a currency in which more and more transactions with international partners will be done. Now, whether the US wants or really wants to go away from the central role of the dollar, again, is a question to which we will, I guess, find answers in the coming months. But Europe's emphasis will be on the broader use of its own currency, the euro. That is, by and large, the second global reserve currency. So it will be used more in transactions with other partners. As a result, we will most likely see the development of the European capital markets as well, to a larger extent. This will help us on the innovation side, as we discussed before, although there are always two sides to the coin, and with broader capital inflows, which we have seen in Europe already in the past 3 months, because Europe is booming in terms of an investment destination as a result of the turbulence on the other side of the Atlantic. And now there are two sides of the coin, because of course this affects the exchange rate and can be seen as affecting competitiveness. But again, let's see how much of a reconceptualization of the global economic system we see as a result. What I'm convinced about is that economic security can be the basis of a positive agenda, not a tit for tat, but something that we can mutually build on in order to reflect each other's sensitivities and interests in a positive fashion.
Thank you, Pawel. So we're slightly over time, but I want to give everybody a kind of a final word before we close out. I would answer Anna's question too, that I think the screening mechanisms that both Europe and the US have provide an opportunity to give an overview of some of the investment money and capital flows that are out there, to make sure that they're meeting commercial objectives in certain markets, but they are new tools, and so the question is kind of how those are going to, I think, play out broader than the normal M&A mergers and acquisition approval processes are. Peter, kind of 15-second final thoughts, comments to kind of close out. Do you have a final thought from today?
Start the countdown. Yes, one final thought is that yesterday's announcement, I think, should be taken as something that will certainly increase global economic disorder, but is also a symptom of something that had pre-existed that announcement, and that I think we already saw the Biden administration trying to tackle. And that is that we have 80 years of the existing institutions and system, and it's not unusual that that's going to start showing some age. So longer term, whatever you think of yesterday's announcement, future U.S. administrations or European governments will have to work together to try to find ways to update and reform the kind of institutions and agreements and norms we that are going to govern the global economy, in the longer term.
Thank you, Peter. Jeannette, final thought? You're on mute, I think.
Terribly sorry. You'd think you'd learn after 6-7 years. Thank you, Penny. I want to build on what Peter just said. Amidst all of this great disruption, and I think there's no better term for that, right? There lies opportunity, and for that, I'm optimistic that there's opportunity to rebuild institutions, to strengthen ties, particularly transatlantic ties, ties globally, and to set the stage for a world order where you can have peaceful and prosperous coexistence, where national security and economic security are not in competition or fighting against each other.
Thank you for that. Pawel, you get the final word.
Thank you so much. I very much subscribe to this idea of building on economic security as the basis for renewed international collaboration. It won't be easy. I mean, we are not really starting in a great fashion, but I think we can overcome these difficulties. But in 5 seconds, what I would say is we need to pay attention to the structural trends in the world economy as well. And one of them is where manufacturing is going, and manufacturing, due to technology change, is largely going in the way of agriculture. So illusions about bringing manufacturing to places where people don't want to work in manufacturing are not doing us a great service. And yes, a diverse economy in which manufacturing plays a role is needed, but I don't think in the 21st century, the way technology is moving, we should be banking on rebuilding national prosperity around manufacturing per se. So structural trends need to be observed with a lot of attention.
Thank you, Pawel. So again, I'm Penny Naas with the German Marshall Fund. I want to thank everybody who's joined us today. Sorry, we've run over just a few moments. We wanted to keep this tight, but there's always so much more to say than what we can cover in our 45 minutes. So thank you to my panelists, Jeannette, Peter, Pawel, and Jean, who had to leave us. But thank you all for your comments, for sharing your time, sharing your intelligence with us. We greatly appreciate it on what is, I know, a very busy morning or afternoon for many of us. So again, thank you very much, and thank you to the audience for attending today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.